In an apparently peaceful home, something dark was happening away from the owner's eyes. Small signs of fear began to appear in her dog. One day, the owner decided to install cameras and discover what was happening. What she saw next left her completely shocked. Before listening to this surprising account, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories full of twists. The first ray of sunshine came through the white curtains of the house, gently illuminating the living room. Sarah observed the morning light dancing over the photographs on the wall, all portraying special moments with Max, her faithful four-legged companion. The caramel-colored Labrador slept peacefully at her feet while she savored her first cup of coffee of the day. Sarah's life had completely changed since she rescued Max 3 years ago. She found him abandoned in a cardboard box, still a puppy, trembling from cold and hunger. Since then, they had built a relationship based on unconditional love and mutual trust. Max had become much more than a pet. He was her confidant, her protector, and her family. At 35, Sarah had achieved a prominent position in an architecture firm. Professional success, however, required long hours at the office, and concern about Max during her absence was constant. That's when her friend Jessica suggested hiring Nancy, a housekeeper who had worked at her house for years. "Nancy is an angel, Sarah," Jessica assured her during lunch. "She's been taking care of my house for 5 years and is extremely reliable. Plus, she loves animals. I'm sure Max will love her." Jessica's recommendation was enough for Sarah. After an initial interview, Nancy began working in her house. The first days were promising. The house remained impeccable, meals were carefully prepared, and Max seemed to adapt well to the new presence. Nancy was a middle-aged woman, with grey hair always tied in a discreet bun. Her gentle smile and calm way of speaking conveyed confidence. In the first weeks, Sarah would come home from work and find everything in order, with Max apparently happy and well cared for. "He's a lovely dog," Nancy frequently commented. "So well-behaved and affectionate. You've done an excellent job with him, Sarah." The housekeeper's words warmed Sarah's heart. After all, Max was her biggest concern. Whenever possible, she would call during the day to check on him, and Nancy always reassured her with positive reports about the dog's behavior. However, after 2 months, Sarah began to notice small changes in Max's behavior. The Labrador, always so cheerful and playful, seemed more withdrawn. His bursts of joy upon seeing her return from work became more restrained, almost hesitant. Initially, Sarah attributed these changes to a possible phase. Perhaps Max was just tired or bored. She decided to increase their walks on weekends and buy new toys to stimulate him. But something still didn't seem right. One morning, while getting ready for work, Sarah noticed that Max refused to enter the kitchen to drink water. His bowl was in the same position as always near the door, but the dog remained in the living room, anxiously looking towards the hallway. "Come on, Max," called Sarah, gently patting the side of her leg. The Labrador hesitated, his lowered ears showing discomfort. Only when Nancy left the kitchen did he finally approach the water bowl. That behavior raised an alarm for Sarah. Max had never shown fear of anything inside the house. He was a confident and sociable dog who loved receiving visitors and interacting with people. Seeing her best friend showing signs of anxiety in his own home was disturbing. During an important meeting at work, Sarah couldn't concentrate. Her mind constantly returned home, worried about Max. She decided to make an appointment with Dr. Michael, the veterinarian who had been caring for Max since his rescue. "Physically, he's in perfect condition," affirmed Dr. Michael after a thorough examination. "Ideal weight, shiny coat, no signs of illness. But I noticed he's more tense than normal. Has there been any significant change in his routine?" Sarah mentioned hiring Nancy, but emphasized that the housekeeper had always shown affection towards Max. Dr. Michael listened attentively, making notes in his file. "Sometimes dogs are very sensitive to changes. It might just be a period of adaptation," explained the veterinarian. "But stay alert to any more significant changes in his behavior." Upon returning home that night, Sarah found Max sleeping in a corner of the living room, something unusual. For a dog who used to anxiously wait for her at the door, Nancy had already left, leaving a note about the prepared dinner. "Hi, my love," whispered Sarah, gently stroking Max's head. The dog slowly opened his eyes, and for a brief moment, Sarah swore she saw fear in his gaze. When he finally got up to greet her, his movements were cautious, almost defensive. That night, while watching television with Max lying by her side, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her maternal instinct screamed that her beloved companion was different, but she couldn't identify exactly what. She decided to pay more attention in the coming days. She started taking notes about Max's behavior, recording times, reactions, and specific situations that seemed to make him uncomfortable. A silent investigation was just beginning, and Sarah had no idea of the disturbing revelations that were to come. The days following the consultation with Dr. Michael were ones of intense observation for Sarah. Each movement of Max, each reaction, was carefully noted in a small notebook that she began carrying with her. The routine of the house continued apparently normal, but to Sarah's attentive eyes, small details began to stand out. On a particularly sunny morning, Sarah decided to work from home. She informed Nancy that she would be in the improvised office, in the guest room, asking not to be disturbed unless absolutely necessary. It was the perfect opportunity to observe the dynamic between Max and the housekeeper without interference. Around 10 o'clock, Sarah heard Nancy calling Max for breakfast. Silently, she opened a crack in the office door, expecting to see her faithful companion run happily to the kitchen as he used to do. To her surprise, Max remained lying in the living room, his ears lowered and his body tense. "Come on, Max. Time to eat." Nancy's voice sounded cheerful, but there was a note of impatience that Sarah had never noticed before. Reluctantly, Max finally got up and walked slowly towards the kitchen. Sarah felt her heart tighten as she saw the Labrador's tail, normally wagging with happiness, completely motionless between his legs. As the day progressed, Sarah noticed other strange behaviors. Max avoided passing near Nancy, always detouring when she approached. During the living room cleaning, the dog cowered in a corner, trembling slightly when the vacuum cleaner was turned on, an exaggerated reaction for a dog that previously didn't mind the noise of the appliance. In the late afternoon, when Nancy said goodbye and left, the change in Max was almost instantaneous. His ears perked up, his tail began to wag timidly, and he approached Sarah as if seeking comfort. "What's happening to you, my love?" whispered Sarah, hugging Max and feeling her heart break as she noticed how he nestled against her, almost begging for protection. That night, Sarah could barely sleep. Her mind was filled with theories and concerns. Could Nancy somehow be mistreating Max when she wasn't around? But how could that be possible, considering Jessica's recommendation and the housekeeper's always cordial behavior? The next morning, Sarah woke up determined to investigate further. She decided to discreetly install security cameras at strategic points in the house. She didn't want to unfairly accuse Nancy, but Max's safety and well-being were her absolute priority. With the help of a friend who was a security technician, Sarah installed small cameras in the living room, kitchen, and main hallway. The equipment was almost imperceptible, camouflaged among decorative objects. Sarah felt a pang of guilt for invading Nancy's privacy in this way, but the image of Max trembling in the corner of the living room wouldn't leave her mind. In the days that followed, Sarah spent her hours at work in constant anxiety, checking the camera images whenever possible. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Nancy performed her tasks efficiently, and Max kept his distance, but there were no obvious signs of mistreatment. It was on a Thursday, almost 2 weeks after installing the cameras, that Sarah noticed something disturbing. While watching the previous day's recordings, she saw Nancy yelling at Max in the kitchen. The audio wasn't clear, but the body language was unequivocal. The housekeeper gestured aggressively, her face contorted in an expression of anger, while Max cowered under the table. Sarah felt her stomach turn. This wasn't the gentle and patient Nancy she knew. It was as if a mask had fallen, revealing a completely different person. But still, there was no concrete evidence of physical abuse. Sarah knew she needed more proof before confronting Nancy. or taking any drastic action. Determined to get to the bottom of the issue, Sarah began creating situations to observe Nancy and Max interacting. She would arrive home at unexpected times with the excuse of having forgotten documents or not feeling well. Each time she did this, she found Max more withdrawn and Nancy with a forced smile on her face. One afternoon, Sarah arrived home earlier and found Max hiding under the bed, something he never did before. When calling for Nancy, the housekeeper appeared nervous, explaining that Max had been frightened by a noise in the street. Sarah pretended to believe her, but her heart was heavy with increasingly concrete suspicions. At night, while petting Max on the sofa, Sarah noticed something that made her freeze. Small scratches, almost imperceptible on the dog's back. They could be from playing in the garden, but the regularity and location of the scratches seemed intentional. "Oh, Max," whispered Sarah, tears forming in her eyes. "What are they doing to you?" That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She stayed awake, planning her next step. She could no longer ignore the signs. Something was definitely wrong, and she needed to protect Max at all costs. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She called the office, informing them that she would take a few days off for personal reasons. She didn't reveal her plans to anyone, not even Jessica. She knew she needed to act with caution and discretion. She informed Nancy that she would be home for the next few days working on a special project. The housekeeper seemed surprised, but maintained her facade of sympathy. Sarah, for her part, prepared for what would be the most tense and revealing week of her life. As the sun set that day, Sarah looked at Max, who slept restlessly beside her. "I'm going to find out the truth," she promised in a low voice, determination shining in her eyes. "And I'm going to protect you no matter what it takes." Dawn brought with it an atmosphere charged with tension to Sarah's house. She had spent the night awake, alternating between moments of anguish and determination. Max, sensing his owner's restlessness, stayed close, as if seeking mutual comfort. Sarah decided that her strategy would be one of discreet observation. She would maintain an apparently normal routine, but would be constantly alert to any interaction between Nancy and Max. The cameras would continue recording, providing additional evidence if necessary. When Nancy arrived that morning, Sarah greeted her with a forced smile. "Good morning, Nancy. I'll be in the office most of the day. Please don't worry about interrupting me." Nancy nodded, her face a mask of professional sympathy. "Of course, Ma'am. I'll do my work without bothering you. And don't worry about Max. I'll take good care of him." Those last words made Sarah's stomach turn. If only Nancy knew how empty and threatening that promise sounded now. Sarah retreated to the office, leaving the door ajar. From her position, she had a partial view of the living room and could hear movements around the house. Max, reluctantly, stayed in the living room, his eyes following Sarah with a mixture of confusion and apprehension. The first hours passed without notable incidents. Nancy performed her household tasks efficiently, and Max maintained a cautious distance. Sarah alternated between her actual work and monitoring the cameras on her tablet. It was around noon that the first disturbing scene occurred. Sarah heard Nancy call Max to eat, her voice initially sweet. However, when the dog didn't respond immediately, the tone changed drastically. "You stupid dog, come eat now!" hissed Nancy, in a volume low enough not to be heard from the office under normal circumstances. Sarah felt her heart race. Silently, she moved to get a better view of the kitchen. What she saw left her horrified. Nancy had grabbed Max by the collar, rudely dragging him toward the food bowl. The Labrador, usually docile and obedient, was visibly trembling, his paws resisting the forced movement. "If you don't eat now, you'll go without anything all day," threatened Nancy, pushing Max's muzzle against the bowl. Sarah had to gather all her willpower not to intervene at that moment. She knew she needed more evidence, more patterns of behavior, before directly confronting Nancy. With tears in her eyes, she watched Max eat hurriedly, clearly frightened. Throughout the day, similar scenes were repeated. Nancy maintained her gentle facade whenever she thought Sarah might be listening, but in moments when she believed she was alone with Max, her true nature emerged. Sarah documented everything: the whispered insults, the accidental pushes, the veiled threats. Each incident was like a knife in her heart, but she knew she had to endure to ensure she had sufficient evidence. In the afternoon, the incident that would be the turning point occurred. Sarah was checking the cameras when she saw something that made her choke with horror. Nancy, frustrated because Max had accidentally knocked over a plant pot, took a rolled-up newspaper and began hitting him repeatedly. "Useless animal." "Look what you did," shouted Nancy, each word accompanied by a blow. Max whimpered softly, huddled in a corner, unable to escape. The scene lasted only a few seconds, but to Sarah, it seemed like an eternity. When Nancy finally stopped, satisfied with her punishment, Max was trembling uncontrollably. At that moment, something inside Sarah broke. The anger, guilt, and pain she had been suppressing exploded in an overwhelming wave of emotions. Without thinking twice, she left the office, running towards the living room. Nancy, surprised by Sarah's sudden appearance, tried to quickly compose herself. "Mom, I wasn't expecting—" "Get away from him!" shouted Sarah, her voice trembling with fury. She positioned herself between Nancy and Max, who immediately ran behind his owner, seeking protection. "I don't know what you're talking about." Nancy tried to defend herself, but the fear in her eyes betrayed her guilt. "I saw everything," declared Sarah, her voice now dangerously calm. "The cameras recorded every moment, every abuse, every blow." Nancy's face paled. She looked around, as if searching for the mentioned cameras. This is illegal. You can't film me without my consent." Sarah took a step forward, her eyes flashing with anger. "What's illegal is what you did to Max. Animal abuse is a crime, Nancy. And I have all the evidence I need." At that moment, Sarah's phone rang. It was her lawyer friend to whom she had sent the most incriminating recordings minutes earlier. She answered, putting it on speakerphone. "Sarah, I received the videos. It's more than enough for a formal complaint. I'm on my way with the authorities." Nancy, realizing the gravity of the situation, began to panic. "Please, ma'am, it was a misunderstanding. I never meant to hurt—" "Enough," interrupted Sarah. "You betrayed my trust in the worst possible way. You mistreated a defenseless being who was under your care. Now, you'll face the consequences." The minutes that followed were tense. Nancy, cornered, alternated between pleas and empty threats. Sarah, meanwhile, remained firm, consoling Max, who was still trembling by her side. When the authorities arrived, accompanied by Sarah's lawyer, the scene was set. The evidence was presented, and Nancy was taken to give a statement. That night, with the house finally quiet, Sarah held Max in her arms, tears flowing freely down her face. "Forgive me," she whispered, caressing the Labrador's soft fur. "I promise I'll never let anyone hurt you again." Max, as if understanding every word, gently licked Sarah's face, his gaze full of love and forgiveness. The days that followed the revelation of Nancy's abuses were an emotional roller coaster for Sarah and Max. The house, previously a haven of peace and joy, now seemed loaded with painful memories. Sarah decided to take an extended leave from work, dedicating herself entirely to Max's recovery and the legal process against Nancy. The mornings began with long walks in the park near the house. Sarah carefully observed each of Max's reactions, her heart clenching every time the Labrador startled at a sudden noise or cowered when someone approached too quickly. Gradually, however, small signs of improvement began to emerge. A week after the incident, during one of their walks, Max suddenly stopped, his nose raised in the air. Sarah followed his gaze and saw a small squirrel jumping between the branches of a nearby tree. To her surprise and joy, Max gave an enthusiastic bark, his tail wagging slightly. It was the first genuine demonstration of interest he had shown since the trauma. "That's right, my love," encouraged Sarah, her voice choked with emotion. "You're safe now. You can be happy again." At home, Sarah implemented a rigorous routine of care and therapy. Dr. Michael, the veterinarian, recommended acupuncture and aromatherapy sessions to help reduce Max's stress. Initially skeptical, Max soon began to relax during the sessions, even dozing peacefully while the delicate needles did their work. Sarah also hired a behavioral trainer, Lisa, who specialized in traumatized dogs. Lisa explained that the recovery process would be gradual and would require patience and consistency. "The important thing is to rebuild Max's trust," explained Lisa during her first visit. "He needs to relearn that the world is a safe place and that not all people represent a threat." The sessions with Lisa were intense and exciting. Through carefully planned exercises, Max was gradually exposed to situations that previously left him anxious. Sarah watched amazed as her faithful companion slowly regained his confidence. A particularly moving moment occurred during the third week of therapy. Lisa brought an assistant, Mike, to help with the exercises. Until then, Max had been extremely cautious with strangers, especially men. Mike, following Lisa's instructions, sat calmly on the living room floor, avoiding direct eye contact with Max. Slowly, encouraged by Sarah's gentle commands and the treats offered by Lisa, Max began to approach Mike. It was tense minutes, with Sarah holding her breath, fearing any negative reaction. To her surprise and joy, Max extended his muzzle, curiously sniffing Mike's outstretched hand. After a few moments of hesitation, he gave a timid lick to the assistant's fingers. Sarah couldn't contain her tears. It was a small gesture, but it represented a huge step in Max's recovery. Lisa smiled, satisfied with the progress. "This is excellent," she commented. "Max is beginning to understand that not all people are like Nancy. It's a slow process, but we're on the right track." Parallel to Max's emotional recovery, the legal process against Nancy was taking its course. Sarah met several times with her lawyer, reviewing the evidence and preparing for testimonies. The camera recordings were irrefutable proof, but Sarah wanted to ensure Nancy faced the maximum consequences for her actions. During one of these meetings, the lawyer brought surprising news. "Sarah, we did a deeper investigation into Nancy's past," he began, his tone serious. "We discovered that she has a history of abusive behavior in previous jobs. There were complaints, but they were never formalized." Sarah felt a mixture of anger and sadness. How did she manage to continue working? How did no one stop her before? The lawyer sighed. "Unfortunately, often these cases are hushed up, or victims are afraid to report. But now, with your evidence, we can finally hold her accountable for her actions." The news reinforced Sarah's determination to pursue the case to the end. It wasn't just for Max, but for all the animals and families who might have suffered at Nancy's hands. Weeks turned into months, and slowly Sarah's house returned to being a happy home. Max, although still having moments of hesitation, was increasingly like the cheerful and confident dog he was before. His playing in the garden became more frequent, and his joyful barks once again echoed throughout the house. One night, while watching a movie together on the couch, Max surprised Sarah. Instead of lying in his usual corner, he climbed onto the couch and settled next to her, resting his head in her lap. It was the first time since the incident that he had sought this level of closeness on his own. Sarah felt her heart fill with love and gratitude. Gently, she began to caress Max's ears, feeling him completely relax under her touch. "We made it, my love," she whispered, leaning down to give a soft kiss on Max's head. "We're getting better." That night, for the first time in months, both Sarah and Max slept deeply, without nightmares or startles. It was as if a page had finally been turned, making way for a new chapter in their lives. Autumn arrived, painting the neighborhood trees in shades of red and gold. For Sarah and Max, the change of seasons seemed to reflect the transformation in their own lives. Each fallen leaf was like a painful memory coming loose, making room for new beginnings. A crisp October morning brought news that Sarah had been anxiously awaiting. The date of Nancy's trial had been set. It would be in 3 weeks. The news brought to the surface a complex mixture of emotions: relief that there would finally be a chance for justice, anxiety about what was to come, and a twinge of fear at the thought of reliving those terrible moments. Sarah decided it was time to share the news with her friend Jessica. After all, it was Jessica who had initially recommended Nancy, and the two hadn't talked much since the incident. With a heavy heart, Sarah picked up the phone and dialed the familiar number. "Hi, Sarah, what a nice surprise." Jessica's cheerful voice sounded from the other end of the line. "Hi, Jess," replied Sarah, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to talk. Can you come over to my house this afternoon?" Jessica's momentary silence revealed that she had caught the seriousness in Sarah's tone. "Of course, I'll be there at 3 p.m. Is everything okay?" "I'll tell you everything when you get here," said Sarah, ending the call with a sigh. The hours leading up to Jessica's arrival were tense. Sarah kept herself busy tidying the house, more out of nervousness than necessity. Max, sensing his owner's restlessness, stayed close, offering comforting licks to her hand whenever she paused. At 3 p.m. sharp, the doorbell rang. Sarah took a deep breath, gave Max one last caress, and went to answer the door. Jessica entered, her face a mixture of concern and curiosity. Her eyes immediately turned to Max, who, to the surprise of both, calmly approached to sniff the visitor. "He seems good," commented Jessica, a hesitant smile on her face. "But you, Sarah, what happened?" Sarah guided her friend to the living room, where they sat down. With Max lying at her feet, she began to tell the whole story. The changes in Max's behavior, the suspicions, the hidden cameras, and finally, the terrible revelation about Nancy. As Sarah spoke, Jessica's face went through a range of emotions: shock, horror, guilt, and finally deep sadness. "My God, Sarah," whispered Jessica, tears streaming down her cheeks. I had no idea. Nancy worked for me for years. I never imagined." Sarah extended her hand, holding her friend's. "It's not your fault, Jess. Nancy deceived all of us." "But I recommended her," exclaimed Jessica, her voice choked. "If I hadn't done that, Max would never have suffered. You would never have gone through this." "Listen," said Sarah firmly, "the only one to blame here is Nancy. She chose her actions. We were both victims of her lie." The two friends talked for hours, crying together, sharing the pain and gradually beginning to heal the rift that the incident had created in their friendship. Max, sensing the emotional atmosphere, moved between the two, offering comfort with his presence. Before leaving, Jessica knelt beside Max, her eyes level with his. "Forgive me, buddy," she whispered, gently stroking his head. To her surprise and relief, Max responded with a gentle lick to her hand. In the days leading up to the trial, Sarah prepared intensely. She reviewed the evidence countless times with her lawyer, rehearsed her testimony, and most importantly, dedicated herself to keeping Max calm and safe. On the eve of the big day, Sarah couldn't sleep. Restless, she got up and went to the living room. She found Max awake, sitting near the window, looking at the full moon that bathed the garden with its silvery light. Sarah sat down beside him, enveloping him in a gentle hug. "Tomorrow we'll face our fears together, my love," she murmured. "You're so brave. You've taught me so much about strength and forgiveness." Max turned to her, his brown eyes shining with an almost human understanding. In that silent moment, Sarah felt a wave of determination invade her. No matter the outcome of the trial, she and Max had won. They had survived, healed, and grown stronger. Dawn brought with it the day of the trial. Sarah dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that conveyed strength and dignity. Before leaving, she knelt beside Max. "I'm going to fight for both of us today," she said, her voice firm. "When I return, we'll begin a new chapter, together." With a final hug for Max and an emotional thank you to the neighbor who would stay. With him, Sarah left for the courthouse. The moving car seemed to carry not just her, but all the emotions, memories, and hopes accumulated over the past months. As the courthouse rose before her, imposing and intimidating, Sarah took a deep breath. The moment of truth had arrived. With firm steps, she walked toward the entrance, ready to face Nancy and seek the justice Max deserved. The courtroom was full when Sarah entered, accompanied by her lawyer, Mr. Robert. The murmur of conversations momentarily ceased, and she felt dozens of gazes turn in her direction. Taking a deep breath, Sarah raised her head and walked with determination to her seat. On the other side of the room, Nancy was seated, her face a mask of indifference. Her eyes met Sarah's for a brief moment, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Those were the same eyes that had witnessed Max's suffering without a hint of remorse. The judge entered the room, and everyone stood up. With a gesture, he began the proceedings. The prosecutor, Mr. David, was the first to speak, presenting the case with an eloquence that captured the attention of everyone present. "Your Honor," he began, "the case we have before us today is not just about animal abuse. It's about betrayal of trust, violation of the safety of a home, and deliberate cruelty against a defenseless being." As the prosecutor detailed the accusations, Sarah mentally relived each painful moment. The camera images were displayed, showing Nancy yelling at Max, pushing him, and, in the most shocking incident, hitting him with the rolled-up newspaper. There were murmurs of indignation in the audience. Sarah noticed that even some jury members seemed visibly disturbed by the evidence. When it was time for Sarah to testify, she felt her heart race. Mr. Robert gave her an encouraging look as she headed to the witness stand. "Ms. Sarah," began the prosecutor, "could you tell us how you noticed the changes in Max's behavior?" Sarah took a deep breath and began to narrate her story. Her voice, initially trembling, gained strength as she described the subtle signs Max had presented, her growing concern, and finally, the terrible discovery. "Max has always been a happy and confident dog," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Seeing him transform into a scared and withdrawn animal, it was as if a part of him had died, and all this happened under my own roof while I trusted Nancy to care for him." The defense attorney tried to question the legality of the hidden cameras, but the judge decided that, given the circumstances and the nature of Sarah's suspicions, the evidence would be admitted. When Nancy was called to testify, her attitude changed dramatically. Gone was the mask of indifference, replaced by a performance of remorse that seemed hollow to Sarah. I don't know what came over me," Nancy whimpered, her eyes brimming with tears that Sarah suspected were false. "I love animals, always have." It was a moment of weakness, of stress. Sarah felt a wave of anger rise in her chest. How dare Nancy try to minimize months of systematic abuse? The trial extended for hours. Witnesses were heard, including Dr. Michael and Lisa, who provided their professional perspectives on the trauma suffered by Max and the long recovery process. Finally, after the closing arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. The minutes dragged on like hours. Sarah felt each beat of her heart, silently praying for justice. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. Sarah held her breath as the spokesperson stood up. "Your Honor, the jury has reached a verdict," he announced. "We find the defendant, Nancy Wilson, guilty of all charges of animal abuse and breach of trust." A collective sigh ran through the room. Sarah felt tears of relief stream down her face. The judge, after hearing the verdict, pronounced his sentence. "Nancy Wilson, for the crimes committed, you are sentenced to 2 years in prison, and you are prohibited from working with animals or in residences with pets for a period of 10 years after your release. Additionally, you must pay compensation to Ms. Sarah to cover the costs of Max's treatment and recovery." When the judge's gavel fell, sealing the sentence, Sarah felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Nancy was led out of the room, and Sarah noticed that the mask of remorse had disappeared, replaced by an expression of contained anger. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd of reporters and onlookers waited. Sarah, exhausted but relieved, made a brief statement. "Today, justice was done not just for Max, but for all animals who suffer abuse in silence. I hope this case serves as a warning and inspires more people to report mistreatment. Our pets are family, and they deserve all our love and protection." As she walked towards the car, Sarah felt her phone vibrate. It was a message from her neighbor. "Max is great. Can't wait to hear the news." With a tired but happy smile, Sarah got into the car. The day had been long and emotionally exhausting, but finally she could go home and hug Max, knowing they had won this battle together. The sun was setting on the horizon as she drove home, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. To Sarah, it seemed the perfect end to a difficult chapter of their lives and the promising beginning of a new journey. The familiar sound of the key turning in the lock made Max raise his ears in expectation. When Sarah finally opened the door, she was greeted by an anxious Max, wagging his tail and spinning in circles of excitement. "Hi, my love," exclaimed Sarah, kneeling to hug her faithful companion. The tears she had contained all day finally found freedom, wetting Max's soft fur. "We did it, boy. We did it." That night, Sarah and Max slept together in the living room, wrapped in a soft blanket on the couch. It was as if both needed the proximity of each other to process everything that had happened. The days that followed the trial brought a series of changes and unexpected challenges. Sarah and Max's story had captured the attention of the local media and soon went viral on social networks. Messages of support flooded Sarah's inbox, along with interview requests and even proposals to turn her story into a book or documentary. Initially, overwhelmed, Sarah decided to use this unexpected attention for something positive. With Jessica's help, who felt motivated to repair what she considered to be her part in the situation, Sarah began organizing talks about awareness of animal mistreatment. "We cannot change the past," said Sarah during her first talk at a local school with Max sitting calmly by her side, "but we can use our experience to create a better future for other animals." Sarah's talks were not limited to just telling her story. She invited veterinarians, psychologists, and animal behavior specialists to provide comprehensive information about how to identify signs of abuse, the importance of the bond between humans and animals, and the legal steps to report mistreatment. Max, surprisingly, seemed to flourish in this new role as an ambassador. His calm presence during the talks was a living testimony to the resilience and healing capacity of animals. Children and adults alike were drawn to his gentle demeanor, often asking to pet him after the talks. One day, after a particularly moving lecture at an animal shelter, Sarah was approached by a young volunteer. "Your story inspired me so much," said the girl, her eyes shining with admiration. "I always wanted to do more for animals, but I didn't know where to start. Now I know that even small actions can make a big difference." These interactions reaffirmed for Sarah that her decision to share her experience was having a real impact. Each person touched by her story was a potential ally in the fight against animal abuse. However, not everything was rosy. Sarah still struggled with feelings of guilt and anxiety. There were nights when she would wake up in panic, imagining that something terrible had happened to Max. On one of these nights, while trying to calm her ragged breathing, she decided it was time to seek professional help for herself. With the support of a therapist specialized in trauma, Sarah began to process her own emotions and fears. She learned mindfulness techniques and gradually began to forgive herself for not noticing the abuses earlier. "You cannot control the actions of others," her therapist gently reminded her during a session, "but you can control how you respond to them. And your response has been extraordinary, Sarah. You've transformed a terrible experience into something that is helping countless people and animals." Meanwhile, Max's recovery continued at a steady pace. The sessions with Lisa, the behavioral trainer, became less frequent as he regained his confidence. A significant milestone occurred when, during a walk in the park, Max initiated a play session with another dog, something he hadn't done since before the abuse. Sarah observed with tears in her eyes as Max ran and barked happily, his tail wagging with abandon. It was as if she was seeing again the carefree and happy dog he used to be. At night, as they prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on how much their lives had changed in the past months. The bedroom, previously a space of anxiety and nightmares, was now a sanctuary of peace. Max, lying in his bed next to Sarah's, seemed perfectly content and safe. "You know something, Max," murmured Sarah, leaning to caress the Labrador's soft ears. "I think we're finally coming out the other side of this journey. It's not the end, of course. We still have a lot to learn and grow, but look how much we've already overcome together." Max raised his head, his brown eyes fixed on Sarah with that look of understanding that always surprised her. He got up, stretched lazily, and then jumped onto the bed, nestling beside Sarah. With a smile, Sarah hugged her faithful friend. "Yeah, you're right. We still have a long way to go, but we'll travel it together one day at a time." As sleep enveloped them, Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude. Despite all the difficulties, she and Max had not only survived, but found a greater purpose. Their lives, previously defined by trauma, were now transforming into a story of hope, healing, and the unbreakable power of love between a human and her pet. A year passed since Nancy's trial. Autumn had returned to Boston, bringing with it a cool breeze and the promise of new beginnings. Sarah woke up early that Saturday morning, the sun barely rising on the horizon. Max, sensing the movement, raised his head from his bed, his eyes sleepy but attentive. "Good morning, my love," whispered Sarah, caressing the Labrador's soft ears. "Ready for the big day?" Max responded with a low, excited bark, as if perfectly understanding the importance of that day. Sarah smiled, remembering how they had gotten to this point. In the months following the trial, Sarah's talks gained more and more visibility. What began as small presentations in local schools soon transformed into invitations to speak at universities, animal rights conferences, and even a TEDx talk. Sarah and Max's story touched hearts across the country, inspiring a wave of awareness about animal mistreatment. More people began reporting suspicious cases, and several cities implemented training programs to identify signs of animal abuse. But the most significant impact came from an idea that emerged during one of Sarah's therapy sessions. Her therapist had suggested that she think about ways to transform her experience into something even more tangible and lasting. "What if we could create a safe place," Sarah had said, almost like a daydream, "a refuge for animals that have gone through trauma, where they could heal just as Max healed." That idea planted a seed that quickly blossomed. With the support of Jessica, who became her partner in this venture, and a growing network of volunteers and donors inspired by her story, Sarah embarked on creating New Beginnings Sanctuary, and today was the inauguration day. Sarah and Max arrived early at the site, a spacious green area on the outskirts of the city. The land, previously abandoned, now housed a modern and welcoming structure, specifically designed to meet the needs of animals in recovery. Volunteers ran from one side to the other, adjusting the final details. Jessica appeared, carrying a stack of pamphlets. "Sarah, you finally arrived," she exclaimed, hugging her friend. "Everything is ready. I can hardly believe we made it this far." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she observed the scene. Spacious and comfortable kennels, exercise areas, therapy rooms, and even a small lake for hydrotherapy, all designed to provide the best possible environment for the animal's recovery. As guests began to arrive, local authorities, supporters, volunteers, and families interested in adoption, Sarah felt a mixture of nervousness and pride. Max as always remained by her side, his calm presence anchoring her. The moment of the opening ceremony arrived. Sarah climbed onto the small improvised stage, with Max sitting obediently by her side. Looking at the gathered crowd, she took a deep breath and began. "A year ago I was in a courtroom fighting for justice for Max and for all animals that suffer in silence. Today we are here to inaugurate a place of hope and healing. New Beginnings Sanctuary is not just a shelter, it's a symbol of what we can achieve when we unite against cruelty and choose love and compassion." Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke about the sanctuary's mission, the rehabilitation programs, the partnerships with veterinarians and behavioral therapists, and the plans for community education. "Each animal that passes through our doors will have the chance to heal, to trust again, and eventually to find a loving home. And each person who comes here, whether to adopt, volunteer, or learn, will leave with a deeper understanding of the special bond between humans and animals." At the end of her speech, Sarah bent down to hug Max, who responded with enthusiastic licks. The audience erupted in emotional applause. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of activities, guided tours of the facilities, demonstrations of positive training, animal-assisted therapy sessions, and most excitingly, the arrival of the sanctuary's first residents, dogs and cats rescued from abusive situations, now with the chance for a new beginning. As the sun began to set, Sarah found a moment of quietude, sitting on a bench in the sanctuary's sensory garden, with Max lying at her feet. She reflected on the journey that had brought them here. "Look at us, Max," she murmured, observing the Labrador now resting peacefully, completely at ease in his new environment. Who would have thought that from that terrible experience something so beautiful would be born? Max raised his head, his eyes meeting Sarah's with that deep understanding that always surprised her. In that moment, Sarah felt a wave of gratitude and purpose invade her. The path had not been easy. There had been days of doubt, nights of nightmares, moments when the weight of responsibility seemed overwhelming. But with each challenge overcome, each animal rescued, each success story, Sarah found renewed strength and determination. New Beginnings Sanctuary was more than just a shelter. It was a testimony to the power of transforming pain into purpose, of using difficult experiences as catalysts for positive change. As the lights of the sanctuary turned on, gently illuminating the dusk, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. She and Max had come a long way from those dark days of abuse and fear. Now they were on the threshold of a new adventure, ready to extend a hand and a paw to others who needed help. "Come on, Max," said Sarah, standing up. "We have a lot of work ahead." Max rose, wagging his tail enthusiastically. Together they walked back to the main building of the sanctuary, ready to face any challenge the future might bring, secure in the knowledge that, with love, compassion, and determination, any obstacle could be overcome. And so as the stars began to dot the night sky, Sarah and Max embarked on the next chapter of their lives, no longer as victims, but as beacons of hope for animals and humans alike, illuminating the way to a more compassionate and just world. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that Sarah and Max's journey has touched your hearts and inspired reflections on the power of love, resilience, and compassion. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories about the connection between humans and their pets. You can find it by clicking on the link to the left. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Every day we bring unique narratives that explore the complexity of life and the infinite forms of love. Don't miss our upcoming content. We would love to hear your opinions and experiences. How did this story resonate with you? Have you experienced or witnessed the transformative power of love between humans and animals? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, each act of kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change a life. Be the change you wish to see in the world, starting with love and respect for our four-legged friends. Until the next story,